Going back to your book, Alan, and I do admit it was written in 1995 when computers weren't quite what they are now. Even though you had the background and the knowledge, you were resisting at the time using them in your armoury against the bookmakers. I assume that's changed now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that changed when things started developing with off-course and offshore betting at the end of the 90s, where you could suddenly bet tax-free off-course if you were using the internet to bet with the firms who were located in Gibraltar. And of course, soon after that, along came Betfair. I mean, I joined Betfair, I think, in December 2001. Would that be right, or would it be 2002? I can't honestly remember which year they started up, but I was there pretty soon after they started. And yes, I mean, inevitably, you cannot now avoid using a computer. For the last 15 years or so, up until quite recently, I've sat in front of a computer most days, and when I've been betting, I've been obviously using the computer to do so. I've had very little on-course betting until about 3 months ago. I finally decided I'd got sick of death of sitting at home all the time, and decided to rejoin the world of betting on course, which I've been doing now for about 3 months.
So with the computers, do you also embrace these super powerful form books, etc. in the computer? Do you still use the old school?
Absolutely not. No, basically I've got, I use the websites that post at the races, Racing UK, and I don't really do anything. I don't do any form of analysis on there. The only records I keep on there are spreadsheets and my betting, as opposed to writing it all out in a diary. I don't have any notes or anything like that online at all. It's all still done the old-fashioned way with me, I'm afraid.
So obviously the game has changed massively in the last 22 years. How, I know it's obvious, but how has it changed, and how have you adapted your methods in that time to stay above water?
I think most people miss the biggest change. Obviously, the biggest change is the rise of online betting, the fact that we can now view films of all the past races going back many years, the fact that the racing is visible to everybody who is willing to pay the subscriptions. That all of that makes a huge difference. The amount of information available to punters now is just beyond belief compared to what was available when I started out in the 1960s. The key for me is that the racing programme has also changed so much. I'm not a great fan of betting in big field handicaps, but the BHA and the bookmakers seem to think big field handicaps are what we all want. Lots of each way betting. Well, I don't bet each way. I'm a win only man. So in recent years, I've moved away from handicap betting and concentrated very much on the racing at the top end of the programme. So on the flat, that would be listed and graded races. Over the jumps, it's good novice races and the best races at the weekends. I still like to go racing midweek, but as much as anything, that's scouting rather than betting. Yeah. The only section of that would be going to the flat racing, where you can still find an edge, in my view, from looking at horses in the paddock, but more significantly from watching them go down to the start, which is something of an art form that it cannot be basically included in the odds. It can only be a subjective thing that each individual watches the horses and makes his own choices from them. But it's been reasonably profitable for me in recent years. But it's only possible at certain courses now because so many of the clerks of the course allow the runners to go straight to the post. My favourite being Salisbury, where because of the makeup of the course, every horse has to go past in front of the stands before the start.
Now, one thing that did surprise me when I read it was that you said at the time, sorry to keep harking back to the book, I know it's the here and now, but most of my research came from there, that all weather was the future. Now, has the future panned out as you expected in the respect of all weather racing?
It hasn't quite, but it's not that far off in my opinion. I'm firmly of the belief that if the originators, if the Muddles, for example, had made the interesting decision to dye their surface green, the antis about all weather that still exist simply wouldn't have had such a case. It's because it looks wrong to us in this country. If you can imagine that in the last century, say 100 years ago, racing on dirt or an artificial surface had been the norm, and then suddenly at the end of the 1980s somebody had suggested racing on grass, you can absolutely guarantee there would be people who would be, this grass racing is rubbish, I don't want to get involved with it, it's all bent, and so on and so forth. Yes, there is definitely corruption within all-weather racing. Nobody can question that. The facts are there on the table. But is that because it's on the all-weather, or is it because it's low-grade stuff? It's a bit of a debatable argument for me. The better all-weather stuff, the maidens in the autumn, the good quality races that are now cropping up, those are really worthwhile races. You can now look to go out and buy a horse specifically to run on the all-weather, and know that there will be and are good races for you to run in. Races worth, you know, £15,000 to £20,000, and of course you've got this all-weather championship now at the end of the season, which offers massive rewards. So I do think all-weather racing, and all-weather racing is a terrible term to use. Artificial surface would be better. Basically, it's just flat racing, but it's flat racing with something different under the horse's hooves than what people were used to. You know?
Okay, so I've got a little bit of an issue with the all-weather, the all-surface, whatever you want to call it, racing. I do feel, even though I don't have figures to back it up, that the amount of times I've backed a horse and I feel like I've had my pocket picked is a lot more frequent than it is on the normal racing of the jumps, i.e. you've struggled to get on at 5 to 2, it's gone off at 5 to 1, jockeys missed the break, stuff like that. Do you think it is more prevalent because it's all-weather, and do you think that it should be, you know, sort of stamped down on more, because it seems to be ignored to my point?
There's no logical reason why it should be more prevalent on the all-weather, other than that maybe it's because, as I say, maybe it's because it's the smaller stables, the jobbing jockeys. I just don't know the answer to that, Simon, and I recognise that your view is shared by an awful lot of people. I mean, I very rarely bet on the all-weather racing these days. The speed figure systems that I wrote about in my books back in the 90s, they don't work on polytrack anyway, so that's become a non-starter. But I'm perfectly happy to bet on an all-weather race that has the level of quality that I like to bet on the turf. In other words, if there's a group race or a listed race on the all-weather, I don't have any problem betting on those. Yeah? One thing positive you must consider about all-weather is that it's fantastic for the horses. They love it. They don't come back shin sore, they don't come back stiff, they don't come back with muscle injuries or foot injuries. I've owned horses and we've run a lot of them on the all-weather. I mean, I had one, my best horse, who won 9 times Salute. He had problems with his joints. It would have been completely impossible to keep him going on turf. But we were able to run him up until the age of 10 years and still winning races. He won a race at Wolverhampton as a 10-year-old, and that just wouldn't have been possible without the all-weather surfaces. The horses really relish it. And that, I think, is reflected in the fact that every trainer in the country now is prepared to run his horses on the all-weather as part of their build-up, you know, in 2-year-old maidens and 3-year-old maidens.